This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Hey, could everyone go on mute? There is some background noise. Thank you. All right. So let's get started. So, as you all know, this is a course for DevOps with AWS. So, what we are going to learn in this course is we're going to understand how the IT architecture looks like, how it is implemented in cloud, what is DevOps, and what what is done differently in DevOps rather than from the technical operations side. Okay, so we'll go through these things individually, one by one, and understand what's happening. I know some of you might have been disconnected on the demo day, or rather, I was, my system had some issue, so you know. I had to restart my system. So let me show you what you missed. Some of you might have missed on that day. You have been through the all this. So particularly from the course curriculum perspective, some of you might miss. I mean, I'll not go in detail, but just run you through these things. So we understood what DevOps is. Okay, so if you look at this slide, mm, okay, hold on. Why is this presentation such a mess? So as you can see, at each stage, we are going to learn about a certain technology. For example, when we are talking about building infrastructure, we will learn Terraform. When we are talking about configuring the systems, okay, uh, we use Ansible for system configuration. The operating system we are going to learn is Linux. Okay, for CI/CD we are going to use Jenkins. For monitoring and alerting, we'll understand about AWS CloudWatch. Of course, I'll also go into detail about different kinds of monitoring and all those things. And source code management exists throughout your life cycle. So we'll talk about Git and GitHub, how to use them. Okay, and you know all these things are we are going to use AWS as our platform. Hey, could everyone go on mute, please? Thank you. All right. Okay. So if you look at the curriculum in detail, we're going to learn in the first week, starting today, we're going to learn about IT architecture, various aspects of networking, and theoretical aspects about virtualization. We'll not learn virtualization because this is cloud course, not a virtualization course. Uh, and then from the AWS perspective, we'll understand how to create AWS account, what are the various services. Okay. What How does billing happen? Okay, what is AWS organizations, which itself is a service. uh, then we understand about policy users, how to create users, roles, groups, and policies within AWS. Okay, then coming to the networking concepts of AWS, we'll understand what is VPC, what is a subnet, gateway, security groups, and also DNS. Of course, these are high level concepts. We will also learn about security groups. We'll also learn about what's the other thing? The routing. Okay, NAT gateway, internet gateway, all these things will come into picture. Uh, from the compute side, okay, I told you, right? Cloud or any IT infrastructure is made of network, compute, and storage. From the compute side, we learn about EC2, uh, L- EBS volumes, AMI, and elastic load balancing, auto scaling group. All these things we're going to learn. And from the storage perspective, we learn about S3. I did not include that, but we'll learn about S3, EFS, and how to attach your disks to your Linux boxes and everything we'll learn. From the operating system perspective, as I said, we are going to learn Linux operating system. What is the Linux file system? How do we navigate? What are the editors? How do you create files in command line and everything? Okay. And also we learn about Linux shell scripting. From the infrastructure as code perspective, I already told you we'll focus on Terraform. We'll also learn a bit about we'll learn about AWS CLI. We'll also learn about cloud formation, a bit about cloud formation, not in depth because we're going to go in deep. We're going to go deep in with Terraform, but not cloud formation. Okay, but I'll also tell you what cloud formation is and how it is used. Uh, from the source code management perspective, how do we manage our code and everything? We use Git and GitHub. So we'll understand about what is version control. How do you version control um, your source code? How do you check that into GitHub? How do others work in collaboration? All these things we're going to discuss in that part. Then the software configuration management perspective, we learn Ansible. Okay, in Ansible, how to install Ansible, how to make sure it connects to the all the instances you want to connect, and what is a playbook, what is a module. Okay, we learn all these things on Ansible. And the next thing is CI/CD. We learn about Jenkins, how to install CI/CD. Um, sorry, how to install Jenkins. How do we create a build job? How do we do parallel builds? How do we do a declarative pipeline? All these things we are going to learn. And from the containers perspective, okay, you might have heard about Docker. Docker is like really hot in the market. So we learn about containers. What is a container? How do we create containers? How do we run containers? How do we create container images? Okay. How do we automate the building of container images using Docker file? What is a Docker volume? And all these things we're going to learn. And next, of course, Kubernetes. Again, I would say Kubernetes is not in depth because it's a very vast subject. It's a very advanced concept, but we are going to learn about how do we, um, what is the architecture of Kubernetes? How do we create a Kubernetes on AWS, Kubernetes cluster on AWS, which is AKS? Okay. Um, and how do we create a service? How do you create a pod? What is the difference between all these things we're going to learn? Okay. And monitoring and alerting, we'll understand more than the aspect of tools. From the monitoring and alerting perspective, we'll understand the theoretical aspects of what is monitoring, what are logs, what are metrics. Okay, so we'll also understand how to do monitoring and alerting with AWS CloudWatch. Like I said, in some cases, monitoring may not be the key function of DevOps folks. And what should you have to have? What should you have to join this course? Okay, so you need to have a computer for sure, a laptop or a desktop doesn't matter, with system administrator rights, at least 4 GB of RAM, i3 or a quad core. I mean, these days I think most of the computers come with that specs, so that's fine. Um, and subscriptions, you need to have a AWS free tier subscription for sure. And apart from that, what else do you need? You need, GitHub, Docker Hub, free services. These are all free services. Okay, you just need to create your account there, and in Freenom, which is a DNS, you know, where you can create a free domain name, your website name, not the website, but the website name, and you will link that with your website you're going to create in your AWS. And on your system, what software do you need to have? You need to have um, Git Bash or Putty, okay, and AWS CLI. On your laptop, you need to install these things, okay. and also Visual Studio Code Editor to edit the code. Whenever we are writing code, we will use code editor to do the stuff. Okay. From the personal perspective, you need to have appetite for learning. Okay, people ask me like, I don't have this skill, that skill. That's all fine. Okay, no prerequisite is for this course. We'll go from beginning. Okay, I mean we go from very basic, so that's fine. But you need to have appetite for learning, and you have to have quality time for participation, and actively participate in class, ask questions, and do the tasks. That should be good enough. Okay, so that's what you might have missed on Saturday if you haven't joined the demo. So I just wanted to give that you know refresher. All right, any questions before we proceed?
So
Kiran sir,
I
this
have
side
one
Rajkumar.
question.
Yes.
I have one question. Is there any prerequisite related to the operating system? I mean, if I have the Windows operating systems, is it fine?
Yeah. You need not have a Linux machine. um, you will learn it on AWS virtual machines, AWS EC2 instances. So you need not have Windows machines is fine.
Okay,
The
fine. There
same.
is no need of Mac OS.
No, you need not have Mac OS. No. I don't have
Okay,
Mac OS either. It's expensive.
okay, fine. Thank you.
Uh,
So
Kiran sir, this side Rajkumar. See, so same question, but I'm having so Mac OS. So is it okay, right?
yeah. See, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
I use a Linux machine. You use a MacBook. Someone else uses um,
Windows.
Windows. Most of us might have Windows. That's fine. You're not going
Okay.
to learn anything on your own laptop. Okay, you can create a cloud has made it so easy, folks. You don't have to worry about anything these days. Even on AWS, you can also create Mac OS if you want. Okay, but that might cost you money. That might not come in free tier. But you can create a Linux virtual machine on AWS. That's what we are going to learn in the class, right? How to create infrastructure on AWS. So you don't have to worry about having Mac is better than having Windows, if you ask me. Not from the DevOps perspective, from the usability also.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. In order of usability, I would say Windows is the least preferred one, followed by Mac, followed by Linux. Anyway, I cannot comment much today because my system froze already. Um, okay, so coming back to our course content, and I mean we discussed what we are going to discuss, and what are the main high level topics that we are going to cover. So now go. Let's get started and understand about my approach and how do we deal with the how do we talk about our course. Again, as I said myself, Kiran, my name is Kiran, and I have about 10 years of experience um, in the field of the platform engineering or the DevOps and SRE, because almost this DevOps concept came into light, or came into practice rather, about 7 8 years ago. Before that, it was not even called DevOps, it was called platform engineering or something else. But yeah, overall I have this 10 years of experience in that, and I worked in big organizations, startups, and okay, in various roles such as DevOps and SRE. Okay, what is SRE? SRE is site reliability engineering. It's like DevOps, but mostly focused on the production environments, whereas DevOps is focused on getting your changes faster to the production environment. SRE is about making your applications in production uh, stable and resilient. Resilient means even if there is a failure, it should come back um quickly. Okay, that's what resilience means. So that's SRE. Anyway, SRE is not our topic of discussion today, but just giving you an introduction. Uh, what else? Okay, yeah, that's about me. So how do we proceed in the course? Okay, so we have these classes from 6 to 7 every day, Monday to Friday. Weekends, yeah, we all need breaks on weekends, right? So that's where You people will focus on practicing. Okay. Um, so in my course, I'm going to, of course, it's a virtual training, so I need to tell you what tools I use. Generally, we connect to GoToMeeting, as you all might have already observed. Let me see. Okay, we all use GoToMeeting to connect. Okay, so I use my Chrome browser to connect to that one. And for my AWS related services or any drawings or anything, I use my Firefox. Okay, um, so I use this draw.io tool to draw some pictures randomly. Okay, I have some documentation, but not the architecture diagrams and other things. But we can, I mean, some of the documentation mostly has some kind of screenshots and other things. Okay, and apart from that, to write anything, I use a notepad. Like, Sublime is a notepad editor, just like your Notepad plus plus. Okay, um, yeah, that's it. Pretty much these are the tools I use. Why am I telling you this? Because tomorrow you shouldn't be confused about what tool I'm opening and all that. And obviously, since our work includes a lot of uh, you know command line work, connecting to Linux machines and all these things, I in my computer I have something called as terminal. Okay, in MacBook also you have something like iTerm or something. In Windows, you would need to install a tool called as Git from this website. Okay, not immediately. We can do it in the next week. Okay, it's a free tool, so don't worry. So you go to git-scm.com and you'll download for Windows, Linux, Bash for Windows. This is for Linux system. So what will that help you is it will give you a command line editor, just like your command line tool or just like this tool. Okay, so through which you can connect to your Linux virtual machines. Okay, that we will come in the next week. But just telling you that these are the tools I'm going to use. Okay, um, so nothing fancy.
So I have one question. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
So
no, go
this
on.
Git bash we need to install on our machine or it's on virtual?
Yeah, that's the problem, right? So to connect to your virtual machines, you need to have Git Bash.
Okay.
Got it?
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
otherwise, unfortunately, Linux doesn't have the native capability to SSH into these machines. Okay, when I say native capability, you cannot use command line editor, your CMD, right, to connect
Hmm.
to these servers using SSH. So you need to have Git Bash. Git Bash is a part of the uh, Git software. Okay, Git software for Windows comes with 3 to 4 tools. One of the tools is called as Git Bash, which is again a command line tool which will help you to connect to your Linux machines. Okay,
So how about a
so
Mac? So for Mac also it's the same thing?
Mac you have iTerm or
Yeah.
I think it's Terminal, so you can connect through that one. You don't have that headache in Mac. Yeah, you don't
Okay.
have to install Git Bash because if you install Git also, it will not have Git Bash in Mac.
Yeah, that's what I was a little bit confused. Like, so
Yes,
which one I have to go? Thank you.
yes. So you already have iTerm. If you are already using a Linux machine or something, that is also fine. Um, all right. So what's the yeah? So that's the approach we are going to take. That's how we are going to you know uh, handle our course. And again, like I told you in the demo, I don't mind being asked questions. Whenever you have a question, just interrupt me and ask me the question. But if it is not related to the particular topic that we are discussing on that day, at that time, maybe you can wait till the end of the class or before the start of the class also. You could ask me questions, generic questions. Okay, for example, if today we are discussing something about network architecture, but you have a question about, let's say, career or something else, so I would say keep that to the towards the end. Okay, then we can discuss that question. Hope that makes sense. Um okay, and most likely I do not have presentations. I will not bore you with PowerPoint. Okay, for some topics we might have some presentations, but mostly I'm going to do the practical aspects, or I'm going to write something in my notepad, or draw something um, you know draw something in the draw.io. But I will not bore you with PowerPoint presentations, that much is for sure. Okay, but wherever required, wherever the documentation is required, I'll share that with you, and you can go through that. Okay. Um, so that's the approach. Like I said, again, Monday through Friday, and occasionally, when um, when I have a late night party or something, or when I'm not well, we might have breaks, but mostly we connect on all the days from Monday to Friday, except public holidays like festivals or something. Okay. So any questions before we proceed?
Yeah, how many hours will be the class?
Yeah, that's a good question. So um, I prefer to say it's about 11 to 12 weeks. Okay. So what is 12 into 5? Almost 60 sessions. Okay. The reason being, I don't really particularly say that, okay, I will teach this topic only for 2 weeks, maybe, or let's say two sessions. Maybe I think some topics might be covered in only 2 days, meaning 2 hours. But what might happen is you might have some interesting questions, so I might go on explaining something else. Okay. So it depends upon how the course goes. So I'm not really particular about covering it in only 10 weeks. Officially, the time is like 10 weeks or 2.5 months, but most likely it might go up to 11 weeks, 12 weeks also. Yeah. So you could say anywhere between 10 to 12 weeks. Okay. So that would be about 50 to 60 sessions overall. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So again, we are particularly focused on AWS, but because I work on Azure, I also teach on Azure. So sometimes I'll give you comparison on how the same service might work on Azure, so that you have that multi-cloud understanding also. Okay. So you can create AWS free tier account as soon as possible because it's free for 1 year. So in case of Azure, it's different. You have to it can be created only for 1 month, but AWS free tier comes for free for 1 year. Okay. That doesn't mean you can create anything on AWS. There are some limits on free tier as well, but for our basic usage, it is more than enough. Okay, but whatever you create after your practice, you will have to also know. I mean, you also have to remember to delete that particular resource. Not immediately. I mean, when we start AWS course, I mean AWS topics, that's when you can do. But you can create AWS free tier account. It's very simple. Go to aws.amazon.com/free, and click on get started for free, and it will ask you for your username and password, and you should have an active debit card or credit card. It will not charge you anything there. Okay, it is just you know um, for verification. Okay, you need to give a debit card or credit card which is working. It might charge you like sometimes 2 rupees, sometimes 60 rupees, but it will be refunded. Okay. But if you create more number of resources than allowed in the free tier and you don't delete them, your account will be charged. Your debit card or credit card will be charged. So be careful. Whatever resources you're creating, um, delete them as soon as your practice is done. Okay. I'll tell you how to set up billing alerts and all that. So that's fine. All right. So that's in a nutshell what you know we need to do. Yeah, there are other services like I told you. You need to create a GitHub account and Docker Hub account, but not immediately. We have time for that. Okay. Okay. If you already have them, that's very well and good. Okay. So let's start with today's topic. Okay. So we'll talk about the fundamentals of IT infrastructure. I'm going to ask you a very basic question so that we can go from there. So type, when I open my browser and type google.com, okay, and hit enter. So from the time I hit google.com or enter on my browser, till the time the page loads, do you know what happens? So from the time I hit enter on google.com and till the page loads, do you know what happens? Or let me put it the other way. How does my browser know how to get the data from google.com?
Based on the IP.
Okay, IP. So we have a new term, IP. What is IP?
It's Internet Protocol.
Internet protocol. Okay. So you mean to say Internet protocol address, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So how does my browser get this IP address?
There is some mapping will be there to the IP address and
Sorry,
site.
your voice is not clear.
I mean, like there will be some like internal this one sort of IP address to the Google site name. There will be some internal this DNS mapping or some mapping will be there. So when we hit that
DNS map.
google.com, yes.
So what's DNS mapping? What's DNS?
DNS stands for Domain Name Service.
Domain name service. So what does it do?
It gives one range of IP addresses to particular site as such. And then it routes the routes when we ping to that particular IP.
Okay. So if I rephrase this one, you're saying that DNS has your website name and the IP address as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's correct, right? So DNS is this thing, but how do my browser get this thing, right? You are all right. So when I hit google.com, no, first thing my browser is going to check is within its own cache. You heard of the term cache? Not CASH, CACHE, cache, or some people say cache. So this is nothing but some memory, like from the recent past. Browser retains some of the details of every transaction. Okay, so it checks within the browser cache if there is a IP address for google.com. If not, what does it do? Next thing, it checks in my system cache. It might be accessed through some other browser or some other tool, so it might check my system cache. If it is not available in the system also, then what does it do? So it goes to where will be the next hop? It goes to my router. Okay, so in my router, some routers have the capability to cache the DNS entries or the IP addresses of the websites. Okay, so what is IP address? How does it look? We'll talk about that. So my router may or may not have it. Then the next logical hop is my internet service provider. Okay, so what is internet service provider? It could be someone like Airtel, Tata, or Act, or whatever service you're using. If you're in the US, it could be AT&T, Verizon, or whatever it is. Okay, so they have something known as DNS resolver. Okay, so this DNS resolver, what it does is it has the records of all the websites that you access on a daily basis, or frequently accessed databases by other users also, and this could already give you the IP address. So if it has the IP address, it will send it to your router. Your router will send it to your laptop. And next time someone is accessing from your home network through a mobile phone also, okay, so they need not go through go till here. It can get it from your router itself. Okay. um, but let's say this DNS resolver also doesn't have the IP address, then where does it go? Okay, so one important thing to note is when we type an IP address like google.com, there is a dot at the end of every domain name. Okay, we don't see that it need not be typed in the address, but every domain name has, this .com, wikipedia.org. Okay, this is absent, but it is there. That dot is nothing but, it's the root server of your DNS. Okay, so there is something called as a root server where your next request will go to. Okay, so these are again maintained by organizations, which we will talk. The root server has the list of all the top level domains. What is a top level domain? Like for example, .com is a top level domain. Okay, .com, .co.in, .gov.in, okay, .edu, .org. These days we have .tech, .website, .me, whatnot, right? All kind of top level domains you have. So, I mean, previously we used to have .com, .co.in, .co.uk, .com.au, .edu, .org only. But these days you have a lot of a very high number of high level domains, including XYZ also you have, .work also you have. Okay, these are all the top level domains, right? So the next level will be your TLD or top level domain. So since we are going to .com, google.com, my request will be sent to .com TLD servers. Okay, so the .com TLD servers may or may not have. Of course, if the root server itself has my IP address, it will resolve it and send it back. If it doesn't have, it will send to .com server. Let's say this is a brand new website I did not access so far. So it will send it to TLD, or no one has accessed so far. So the .com TLD will have the list of all the websites bought under its name, like not bought, registered under .com. Okay, it could be all the websites. Okay, now comes the interesting question. So if I want to start a google.com website, can I start it? I can create a couple of servers on my AWS account and start creating some simple application. And can I name my website as google.com?
No, you should register it first.
Yes. So where do I register it?
Using
So
the
there are
domain
companies.
registry.
Correct. So there are organizations called as registrars. Okay. For example, you might have all seen ads about GoDaddy, which is one of the popular registrars. You have Namecheap. Okay. We have Freenom, which you might use to create a free domain name. Okay. Or you know. Mm, uh, what else? You can also register on AWS Route 53. All these are various registrars from where you can buy websites. Of course, what if I buy from GoDaddy, but you try to buy the same website from Freenom? For example, let's say I want to create a website called as DevOpsGym.com. Okay, I bought it from GoDaddy. Can you buy it from Route 53, the same website? No, right? It should be unique, just like your vehicle numbers, because you just because you're registering your vehicle number in some other region, I cannot have the same vehicle number in a different RTO office, right? So there is a centralized database that is managed by IANA and ICANN, Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. ICANN stands for Internet Consortium of Assigned Numbers and Names. Okay, these two organizations are responsible for, I mean, IANA particularly is responsible for, all the top level domains, and they maintain the central registry. So even if I create a website from GoDaddy And even if you try to create the same some website from Route 53, it says this domain is already sold to someone else. Okay, so even Google has its own register, I guess. Okay. Facebook has its own registry. They buy their own domains from there. They don't have to, because they have registered with IANA and ICANN, so they can register their own domain names. Okay. Yeah. So DevOps gym.com, for example, is one of the domain names that I buy from GoDaddy. You cannot buy from anywhere else also. It is already registered with the IANA. So the top level domain will send your request to where? Your registrar. Who is the registrar? The person from where you bought your domain name, right? Registrar. So there are two ways you can do here. When you create your website, you can update your IP address of your server here itself directly. Okay. For example, let's say devopsgym.com, not Google, but devopsgym.com is my IP address, is my domain name. So I'll keep my IP address in my registrar itself. For example, let's say I bought it from Namecheap. In the Namecheap, I'll maintain this record. Like I say, devopsgym.com. If someone is coming to this one, route to this IP. Okay. So the request will come to my server, which might be hosted on AWS or some other location. So the request will come to my particular server to serve that particular request. Okay. Or in some cases, what you might want to do is, you might have bought the website from the registrar, but you want to maintain your own DNS zone. You want to, because you want to easily update the details and always don't want to go to your registrar to do that. Let's say you're already using AWS Route 53, so you can manage multiple websites from the same location. So you prefer to maintain your own DNS or on the cloud. So in that case, you know you have to update some details about this DNS zone in your registrar, what we call it as name servers. Of course, we'll do the practical of this part, don't worry. We will see how to update our name servers from Route 53 to registrar. Okay, in that case, your registrar also doesn't have the IP address. It will send the request to your DNS zone. Your DNS, based on the name servers you update, and your DNS zone will send it to registrar, and registrar will send to .com, root, and your DNS resolver within your ISP, then to your router, then to your browser. Okay, and good thing about DNS is it is cached in various locations. Okay, and also there is something called as time to live, ETL, time to live, meaning uh, how often should this refresh? For example, you might, for example, for devopsgym.com, initially you might have one website, one address, but due to some changes, you might have changed it. If all these people have the old addresses, then it will not go anywhere, right? It needs to have the latest IP address. So you can say, generally people set 86,000 as 86,000 seconds as the TTL. That means 1 day. So if the query is done for 1 day, till tomorrow, it will be valid. You need not get it again. After 1 day, it will go through all these paths, and everyone will have the refreshed refreshed domain name, or refreshed IP address, sorry. So that's what happens when you hit google.com or any domain name in your browser. Till the
Kiran, one
time it
question.
just goes. Go on, please.
Don't we have the static IP address? Why do you want to refresh every time?
No. Static IP address is from the person who is managing your database, right? If it is the same thing, you still need to get the confirmation that it is the same thing. So time to live is not related to static IP. You may have a static IP. It might never change, but
Huh?
DNS will refresh once in a day, or how many ever TTL you set it up. Okay, this is particularly useful when your IP address is changing. Otherwise, it will still, all these things will have a older version of your IP address. Okay, and it's highly distributed version. It takes, as you know, nanoseconds only. Okay, because we are not even talking about the page load time. We are only talking about getting the IP address. So yes, TTL is not related to static IP. Even if you have a static IP, the DNS will have your time to live option. Okay, but you can configure as high as possible. You can configure it as 2 days or 3 days. By default, it is configured to 1 day, so that your DNS will refresh every 1 day. Okay, but
Yeah,
some
thanks.
people might have higher, if they are sure that they are not going to make any changes, they might have higher TTL as well. Static IP and dynamic IP is from the operations, I mean from the the website maintainer perspective, but TTL is again at the DNS level. Of course, you yourself can configure the TTL for your websites, um, but again, need not necessarily that, since you have a static IP, maybe for whatever reason you have to there is a disaster recovery situation where your primary data center is affected, so you're moving all your workloads to secondary workloads, right? In that case, you will have to update your DNS, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
these days DNS is really getting updated very fast, even without a relation to TTL. But yeah, TTL is still there. We'll come to TTL when we discuss Route 53. Don't worry about it. Okay,
thanks, Kiran.
so this part is done. So far, what my browser got is, what did my browser get after all these transactions? Only my IP address. But as you might have noticed, it takes only a very few seconds, or rather nanoseconds, to get the IP address. Then if I have the IP address, I will go to that particular resource wherever it is hosted. In this case, let's say this is hosted on my AWS. So once I get the IP address, the page is not even loading. You will go to the you'll go to the location where the website is hosted. Okay, it could be a VM. Okay, um, so here's the thing. Let's say you're Google. You have a very good you've been in the IT world for a long time. So let's say there is only one single compute. Okay, so we talk about server, right? We say that, okay, the request will go to the server IP and all these things. But what is a server? What is a server?
It stores everything. It's like a hard disk.
It's like a hard disk. Okay. Anyone else?
When whichever is mapped to that server with whatever the IP address, it serves the data.
It serves the data. Okay, you're telling about the functionality, but what is server? What is a server?
It's a physical
A
machine where it
space.
stores the,
Well, it should have, it has some set of, a specific operating system and set of softwares to process the request.
Okay, you're saying what it has, but what is a server?
Can we say it as a space?
So basically, like we have like some applications are not hosted at like your local machine. So uh, in that kind of a setup, which is like a client server setup, like the applications would be running on the server, and like uh,
No,
it,
again,
it
you're saying the functionality of the server. What is a server? The primary question is, what is a server?
It's a piece of computer hardware and software.
Like a master computer.
Master computer. Okay, so what's the difference between master computer and student computer?
Yeah, well, it has some specific set of softwares that is required to run our application on the server. It provides some,
Okay, so
and
so
yeah,
if I have a desktop computer, okay, or a laptop computer, and if I install this software, can it become a server?
Or it should require hardware also, hardware and software.
Yeah, I have the hardware. My laptop has hardware, right? Your laptop has hardware. You could have a desktop computer which has the hardware. So what's hardware? Hardware is there. Can it become a server?
It should have capability to run the programs.
Yeah, my laptop has 16 GB RAM, i7 processor. Can it become a server?
I guess it can become server.
Exactly. A server is nothing but a computer, right? A server is nothing but a computer. But why is it called a server? Because it serves a specific purpose. What is that purpose? That doesn't mean it has to be, you know, when we're talking about, someone has said client server architecture, right? I'll come to that maybe tomorrow. But a server is nothing but a computer, you know, with the basic CPU, RAM, and some software. Okay, you can install Apache on your laptop and it becomes a web server. Of course, our routing mechanism. Hey, could everyone please go on mute? There's an echo. Um, our routing mechanism may not support uh, the way to host a website on your laptop, but if you also can get a static IP from your ISP, and you know, you can configure some networking settings, you can host an application from your own laptop. But the problem is your laptop is not configured from a physical perspective, from the hardware perspective, to run 24 hours 7 days a week, because it will crash eventually, right? um, so server, I mean, from the you know, the physical characteristics of a server is a specially made machine, okay, which again is like your regular computer only from the operating system perspective. For example, I have Linux operating system. So on the EC2 instances or Amazon cloud also, I can create an Linux machine and I can host my application. I can install Apache, which is a simple software. I can install the same software on my laptop also. Okay, so but from the physical description of a server, you know, servers are especially made hardware which can run 24 hours 24 hours throughout the year, 365 days. Of course they also fail, that's a different matter, but they can come back. I mean, you can make them come back. Okay, the point I'm trying to make is server is nothing but a base, any kind of computer, okay, which has a BIOS, and you can install an operating system, and on top of it you can install any software you need. Okay, so your laptop can become a server if you have that networking configuration to do. Okay, but you know, when we talk about hosting applications on an enterprise scale, you talk about enterprise level servers, like, you know, you have Dell servers or HP servers, which are specifically made to handle high loads. Okay, these are also, let's say you have good amount of money, you can buy this server and also run your Windows 10 on this. It can act as your client also, I mean your regular laptop also. Okay, but of course we don't do that. So this is one of the, you know, server machines. So the importance of why we need these servers is, as I said, they are configured to handle, you know, high temperatures. Of course you need to have cooling systems, and also some of them might have multiple LAN ports. This one doesn't have, it's a desktop actually. Why are they showing it in, for example, take this one. Okay, so it has multiple network cables. Okay, and all that stuff. I can't, why am I not able to get good images? Mm, mm, mm. Okay, since these servers are supposed to run 24/7 and also they need to be always available, you have multiple network connections, for example. In your laptop or desktop, you might have one LAN port. These days, some laptops don't even come with LAN port. They're too dependent on the Wi-Fi. Okay, you have to again buy another dongle. But for the servers, they're connected through network cables, right? So you have to you have multiple network cables. Even if one connection fails, and another one will run. Okay, so coming back to my original point, let's say google.com, and google.com is hosted on a single server. It might be a very powerful computer, like it might have 1 terabyte of RAM and let's say 200 cores. So in our laptops, typically if it's a quad core or a i3, you might have 4 cores, 4 CPUs. Okay, if it is a high-end computer like i7 or i9, you might have 8 cores, or some computers come with 16 cores at the max, right? That means it itself is a super powerful computer. All right. Uh, so for example, my laptop has 8 cores of eight CPU cores. Okay, some of your laptops might have 8, or some of you might have 4 cores. Okay, uh, so you might have such a powerful computer, but if your entire application is running on it, remember, in the world of IT, there's always a chance of your systems going down, or your server not becoming unresponsive, meaning users are trying to reach to it, but it is failing. Okay, so let's say Google has this powerful computer, let's say not 1 terabyte RAM, but 10 terabyte of RAM, and instead of 200 cores, let's say we have 500 cores of CPU. Okay, 500 CPUs, but this becomes unresponsive. So what happens then? The software has crashed, or due to some networking issue it is not working. What happens then to the end users, people like us? We're trying to access Google.
Server non-available, it comes.
Yeah, so you'll not be able to access google.com services. Okay, so to mitigate this problem, what should Google do, or Google or any application for that matter should do?
It should route to some other server which is live.
Okay, so you're saying Google should have another server to which it should route, right? So do you mean to say once this failure happens, then this connection should switch?
Yes, but
That will still lead to a lot of users facing the service not available or page not found errors, right? In the time you switch.
we should put something on the front of the server, that's load balancing or
Okay,
routing.
cool. Yeah, so that's where that's where I'm trying to come as well. Good point. So no matter how good a system you put, how good a server you put, there is always a chance of it going and failing. Okay, so if you have a single server to handle all your load, no matter how good that system is, okay, it is still called as a single point of failure. Okay, because there is only one component to take care of all your traffic, and in IT world we assume that it will always go down. Not only in IT world, even in real world also, you always have parallel things and backups and everything. Okay, so it's always a disaster if you have a single system. So you need to have multiple systems to handle your load. But remember, in DNS, you can have only one domain name mapping to one IP address. Okay, you can have only one website name, one IP address. Let's say Google has two servers now, instead of using 10 TB RAM for one system, they have two systems, which one has 5 TB RAM and another has 250 cores of CPU. Like these systems, they have two instead of one big system. But still, which IP address do they update here, right? So if you update this IP address, again the original problem will happen. Always the traffic is going to this one. If you update this one, again the same problem. Your IP all the traffic is going here. So that's why we need a component called as load balancer, okay, which routes your traffic to one of the devices. So this has an IP address which you are going to put in your DNS records. So the traffic will come to your load balancer, and your load balancer will distribute the traffic across these two machines. Okay, a load balancer could be another server, or it could be a networking device like your router, which is specifically built to handle this routing mechanism. Okay, so its work is very simple. It receives the traffic and sends the traffic to one of these two servers. Okay, so if one of the system fails, you still have the other system. But why just stop at two systems, right? Your Google, you can create a lot of systems. So you can have as many as possible, because you solved the problem of domain name to IP address mapping with the help of your application load balancer or your load balancer. Okay, so you can have as many servers as possible for high availability. Okay.
Kiran, I have a question here. So
Mhm.
basically, like to the initial problem when there was single point of failure, like one request went and it failed, so the user
Mhm.
would get that unavailability message. But here,
Mhm.
even if we have like multiple servers, so let's say
Mhm.
it comes to the first one and it fails, so user would still get it, or like even before getting it, it gets routed to another server.
Yeah, that's right. So your load balancers have the discovery mechanism, okay, or health check mechanism, where they will be able to check if your load, even if the user is accessing or not, they will periodically check your servers for the functionality. For example, it need not be even router failure. Your software, for example, all of these are running some web server software like Apache or Nginx. It will check if your service is accessible on this server or not. If it is not accessible, your load balancer, I mean, at least the modern load balancers will declare this as unhealthy, and they will take it away from their pool. I mean, the server is still there, but for the load balancer's perspective, it is not there. It will not route the traffic to this one. Yeah.
Mhm.
So they can do it in the fraction of seconds. So real-time updates will happen, and it will redirect to the one of the other machines. Okay.
Got it.
Yes. Yeah. Old load balancers, you know, on-premise environment might still show some kind of errors for the users, but when they refresh, the next request go to the load balancer. The load balancer will send to either of these other available servers. Okay. Of course, when we are even talking about these servers, that doesn't mean these go also very often, like once in a day or something like that. They are also highly available, but there is a possibility that they might go. That's why you always prepare for redundancy. This is what we call redundant systems. These are not active passive. These are all active, 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 meaning all the servers are running at the same time. Okay. So in the case of active passive, there is always the chance that user might get page not available or service not available. In this case, um, that's never gonna happen. Okay, even it happens for only a momentary basis, and when your browser refreshes, it will go to the next page. Okay, so tomorrow we'll further discuss upon these things. Okay, whether the physical servers are used or the virtual machines are used, what's a virtual machine, and what is a three-tier architecture, what is an n-tier architecture. All these things we'll discuss tomorrow. Okay, so today's topic for your study is DNS. Okay, study about DNS. Let me, there is a nice video. hmm Running late for my next class, but quickly get it for you. uh, so how DNS works. Yeah, this is a really, really good video. um, Try to go through this one. I mean, whatever I explained, but with better graphics and better narration. Something has come up, some stupid ad. Anyway, go through that video and study DNS, understand DNS. Okay, don't worry, we have a detailed session about Route 53, which is the DNS service for AWS. We'll see how to configure a domain name. I mean, you can create a free domain name for yourself. Let's say, for example, um, sunita.tk or some website you can create, and you can understand how to configure the IP address and everything. We'll go to that part also. Don't worry. Okay. All right then. I know some of you might have questions. Please hold it for tomorrow, and we'll discuss it tomorrow. All right. Thank you so much for joining. Talk to you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kiran. Have a great day.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.